Before there was a devil, there was a bureaucrat. Before there was a monster, there was a prosecutor wearing a celestial badge, carrying an official report, and walking corridors of cold light that no human eye has ever seen. You have been taught a particular version of evil. You have been handed an image formed over centuries of painting and theology and fear. A red figure, a serpent, a fallen star consumed by its own magnificent wrath. But the oldest texts do not describe any of that. They describe something far stranger, something that does not rage, something that watches, reports, and files its findings before a throne you could not endure to look upon, in a court that has been in session since before you drew your first breath. The Hebrew word is ha-satan. The definite article matters. It is not a name. It is a title, a function, a role within a hierarchy as structured and procedural as any government you have ever lived under. The root of the word is a verb, to oppose, to bear a grudge, to stand against. When the earliest authors of the Hebrew Bible attached the article ha to that root, they were not naming a cosmic villain. They were describing a position, the adversary, the accuser, the one assigned to scrutinize and prosecute. You find this figure in the Book of Job. And if you read it carefully, what you encounter is not fire and damnation. The heavens in Job are cold, formal, and frighteningly ordered. The sons of God present themselves before the throne, and among them comes the one who bears the title. He has been roaming the earth, he reports. He has been walking back and forth across it. There is an auditor's precision to the language, a quality control officer returning from an inspection. The throne room does not crackle with war. It hums with ceremony. The floor is ice. The ceiling burns. The figures speak in the measured cadence of a court proceeding that has been running uninterrupted since before your civilization existed. The terror of Job's universe is not that evil is wild. The terror is that it is organized. The adversary does not act on personal malice. He petitions. He requests. He lists the specific terms under which he is permitted to proceed. Only his livestock the authorization grants. Only his flesh you may not touch. He operates within parameters set by a higher authority, and the catastrophe that follows, the dead children, the ruined fields, the body covered in affliction, is not chaos. It is a controlled experiment conducted above your world without your knowledge or consent. The court is still in session. The file with your name on it is still open somewhere above this ceiling you have never thought to question. You find the same figure in the book of Zechariah. The high priest Joshua stands in stained garments before the throne. The adversary stands at his right hand, positioned exactly as a legal prosecutor would be, ready to speak against him. The scene is not demonic. It is juridical. It is the architecture of a courtroom, and the figure who stands there is integrated fully into that architecture. He is not an outsider. He is staff. This is the world from which your understanding of evil descends. Not a war between heaven and hell, not a rebellion igniting the cosmos, but something colder and more intimate than that. A formal celestial tribunal, vast and indifferent, in which the suffering of a particular man on a particular patch of earth is a line item in a proceeding he cannot access and was never invited to attend. The bureaucracy of the divine court extends downward through the levels of creation, and at its base, small and mortal and largely irrelevant, you sit in your darkened room tonight, not knowing which files are open above you. Picture the throne room as the oldest texts render it. You approach a wall of crystalline material that appears to be constructed from compressed hailstones, enormous and bluish white, yet bordered by fire that does not melt it. You pass through, and the floor beneath your feet is blinding snow, firm and cold and luminous. The ceiling you cannot measure. It is somewhere above the burning, somewhere past the lightning that moves through the upper heights in continuous, silent arcs. At the center, elevated above the rivers of fire that pour outward from its base, is the throne, and it resembles ice, and it resembles a sun you are not equipped to look at directly. The figures that move near it do not walk. They process. They stand. They speak in a register that is not speech, but something that uses speech the way a waterfall uses water, as a vehicle for a force that would exist without it. The adversary moves through this space as a familiar, as someone who has presented himself before it many times. He does not cringe. He reports. And the report he delivers concerns you, or someone very much like you, living far below in the dry heat of a world made of ordinary clay. There is a particular stillness to the horror here. The worst thing about Jog's universe is not the suffering, it is the distance. The court above does not stop. The proceedings continue, and down on earth, the man at the center of the case cannot hear the arguments being made on his behalf or against him, or the terms being quietly negotiated over the duration of his grief. This is where the adversary begins, not in fire, in paperwork, not in rebellion, in protocol. The deepest evil, in the oldest framing humanity ever gave it, is not chaos. It is a system running exactly as designed. Everything changed when Jerusalem fell. In 586 BCE, the armies of Babylon broke through the walls of a city that its people had believed to be protected by the direct presence of their God. The Temple of Solomon, the house of the divine name, the most sacred structure in the world they knew, was dismantled and burned. The priests were taken. The royal line was broken. The population was marched into exile under foreign skies. And the theological crisis that followed was not abstract. It was existential, visceral, and completely without precedent. If the God of Israel was the supreme being, then how had this happened? More precisely, who was responsible for it? Strict monotheism carries a problem that no amount of doctrine fully resolves. If there is only one God, and that God is sovereign over everything, then everything that occurs, including the destruction of your city, the death of your children, the burning of everything you held sacred, must originate from that same God. The early Hebrew Bible does not flinch from this. It says so plainly. In 2 Samuel 24, the older text reads without apology, "The Lord incited David to take a census of Israel, and the census was considered a sin, and the punishment that followed it was lethal. God moved the king acted, God punished. The chain is clean and disturbing, and it places the origin of human transgression inside the divine will itself." Then the exile happened. Then the theology began to change. Something descended from a height you cannot measure, and what it left behind still walks among you, unseen, cold, and patient. But the shift began not with a monster descending, but with a word disappearing from a sentence. In 1 Chronicles 21, the later retelling of the same census story, the same event has been quietly rewritten. The verse no longer says, "The Lord incited David." It says, "Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to take a census." The definite article is gone. Ha-Satan has become Satan, not a title, but a name, not a role, but an entity, not a divine instrument, but an autonomous force operating in the world with its own agenda. In one sentence, across the distance between two books of the same canon, a theological revolution occurred. Evil was quietly relocated, God was quietly exonerated, and the adversary was quietly promoted from prosecutor to independent agent. This is not coincidence. This is a community in crisis doing what communities in crisis have always done, revising the architecture of their theology to survive a catastrophe that their existing framework could not adequately explain. The God who permitted Babylon to burn Jerusalem could not remain the God who also authored the impulse to sin. The distance between divine sovereignty and divine goodness had to be maintained, and the only structural solution was to introduce, or to gradually amplify, a separate locus of evil, a counteragent, a force that operated within the world but was not the same as the God who made it. Into this theological opening stepped something that was already waiting in the air above them. The Israelites in exile were not isolated. They were embedded in the Persian Empire, the most sophisticated imperial administration the ancient world had yet produced. And the religion of Persia was built on a philosophical architecture they had never encountered before. Zoroastrianism, the faith of the Persian state, proposed something radical. The universe is a battleground between two uncreated forces of equal and opposite orientation. Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of unalloyed light and truth. Angra Mainyu, which translates most directly as the destructive spirit, the hostile mind. These two forces did not share a court. They did not work within the same administrative hierarchy. They opposed each other across all of creation and everything. Every human choice, every natural event, every breath was a theater of that opposition. This was not a prosecuting attorney. This was a war. The Jewish thinkers who encountered this framework did not copy it wholesale. They could not. Their theology was organized around the absolute sovereignty of one God, and they were not prepared to grant Angra Mainyu equal status to the divine. But the structure of the idea, the independent, powerful, organized force of evil, the hierarchical command structure of hostile spirits, the apocalyptic end-of-days confrontation between light and dark, entered their thinking and never fully left. By the time the Second Temple period reached its later centuries, the adversary of Job's cold courtroom had developed something the original figure did not possess. He had acquired a kingdom. He had acquired commanders and lieutenants. He had acquired, in the language of those who wrote about him, dominion. The Zoroastrian contribution to the figure of the devil is not a secret. Scholars have mapped it thoroughly. But the magnitude of it tends to get lost in theological summaries that treat it as a footnote. It is not a footnote. It is the hinge point between the ancient world's understanding of evil as a managed function within divine government and the later world's understanding of evil as a structured, opposing empire pressing against the walls of creation from the outside. The Persian exile did not just change Jewish politics, it changed the metaphysics. It changed the shape of the cosmos. And the adversary who had once walked quietly into the divine court with his reports and his authorized parameters stepped out of that court, stood in the wider dark, and began to grow. There is a book that was not supposed to survive. It is older than most of what you know as the Bible. It was read and quoted and treated as sacred by some of the most serious theological minds of the ancient world. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means it was important enough to preserve in a desert cave by people who believed they were preparing for the end of all things. The New Testament references it directly, and then, gradually, systematically, over the course of the 4th century, The institutions that were consolidating power over Christian doctrine decided that this book was dangerous, and they worked to ensure that it disappeared. The Book of Enoch survived anyway. It survived in Ethiopia, carried by a church that never accepted the Roman decree. It survived in fragments, in dark jars in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. It survived because the information it contains is difficult to fully erase, and because some part of every age that encounters it recognizes that it is describing something older than the arguments that were used to suppress it. What it describes is this: the origin of worldly evil did not begin with a singular figure named Lucifer, proud and luminous, staging a celestial revolt against the throne. That narrative came later, assembled from fragments and retrofitted backward into the tradition. What the Book of Enoch describes is something stranger and more physical, and in some ways more disturbing. A group, a descent. A decision made collectively by 200 beings who were not supposed to make it. They were called the Watchers. Their function, in the cosmology of the earliest Enochic material, was observation, the same cold, supervisory orientation as the figure in Job. But where the adversary in Job remained within his authorized parameters, the Watchers did not. They gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, in the high cold of the northern borderlands, and they made a pact with each other. Not a rebellion against God as such, not a manifesto of cosmic pride, but something more intimate and more catastrophic than that. They wanted what they were not permitted to have. They descended. Something descended from a height you cannot measure, and what it left behind still walks among you, unseen, cold, and patient. Enoch names the commanders, Shemahaza, who led the descent, and Azazel, who is the one that concerns the history of evil most directly. Azazel did not simply cross a boundary and corrupt himself. He brought his knowledge with him. He taught the forging of weapons. He taught the art of cosmetics and seduction. He taught the compounding of roots, the preparation of incantations, the manipulation of the hidden forces in the world's material fabric. He was a dark Prometheus, and like Prometheus, the gift he brought could not be unbrought. The knowledge entered the world, and it stayed. The women the Watchers descended for bore children. The children were the Nephilim, and the oldest descriptions of them are not symbolic. They were physical realities in the cosmology of First Enoch, enormous, ravenous, consuming everything the land could produce, and then consuming each other, and then consuming humanity. They drank the blood. They devoured the flesh. The earth became, in the language of those texts, saturated with iniquity, and the cry of it ascended to heaven like a sound that could not be ignored. What interests the history of Satan most is what happened after the flood destroyed the physical bodies of these giants. The Book of Enoch is precise about this. The spirits of the Nephilim did not simply dissolve. They were released from their physical forms as disembodied entities, and they remained in the world. They afflict the living. They hunger for physical substance they no longer possess. They are the demons of the world as the Enochic tradition understands it. Not fallen angels exactly, but the orphaned spirits of a hybrid race that should never have existed, still moving through the spaces between things, still pressing against the edges of the life they were expelled from. This is why the Book of Enoch was banned. Not simply because it was old or strange or theologically inconvenient in minor ways. It was banned because it proposed a completely different account of how evil entered the world, and that account was incompatible with the institutional structure that was being built over the ruins of the older tradition. Augustine of Hippo, working in the 4th century, needed evil to be the fault of Adam. He needed humanity's corruption to be inherited, transmitted through the bloodline from the first man's act of disobedience in a garden. This framework placed the origin of human sinfulness inside human nature itself, and it made the Church's sacramental machinery, baptism washing away the stain of inherited guilt, essential and irreplaceable. The Book of Enoch breaks that architecture. If demons are the spirits of Nephilim, if Azazel taught humanity war and deception, if the corruption of human civilization was introduced from outside by beings who violated their cosmic mandate, then the fault is not primarily Adam's. The fault is distributed across a much older and stranger catastrophe. And if the fault is not Adam's, then the entire doctrinal edifice that Augustine was building begins to develop cracks. So the book was called Dangerous. Rabbi Simeon ben Yochai had already declared it heretical to believe that immaterial angels could possess flesh and blood desires. Augustine and Athanasius closed the canonical doors more firmly, and the Watchers were removed from the mainstream narrative, and Azazel faded from the names people were taught to know, and the singular abstract devil of later Christian doctrine took the stage alone, stripped of his collaborators and his specific history and the physical world he had infected. But the knowledge the Watchers left behind did not disappear with the book. It only went deeper. It moved into the hands of the communities that refused to forget it, into the sectarian scrolls preserved in desert caves, into the esoteric streams that ran underground beneath the official theology. And in those places, it kept moving, kept evolving, kept gathering weight and structure until it emerged in the writings of a desert community called the Essenes, with a new name and a new and far more terrible scope. Somewhere in the cliffs above the western shore of the Dead Sea, in the dry heat of the Judean desert, a community of men built a world apart from the world. They called themselves the Sons of Light. They believed, with the total conviction of people who had decided to stake everything on a single theological proposition, that the age they were living in was the final age, that the forces of darkness were at peak strength, that the invisible war dividing all of creation between two irreconcilable dominions was about to become visible, literal, and total. They copied texts in the night by lamplight, stored them in sealed jars, and prepared for a battle that they believed would last 40 years and end with either the complete destruction of everything they knew or the final victory of light over a darkness so organized and so powerful that it required a military manual to oppose. The War Scroll is that manual. It is one of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is not a theological meditation. It is a battle plan. It specifies trumpet signals and banner inscriptions and battle formations and the precise rotation of priestly units during combat so that the sacred rites are never interrupted, even as the war reaches its climax. It describes a conflict that will involve the hosts of Belial on one side and the Sons of Light, supported by their angelic allies, on the other. It is written with the practical, procedural precision of people who intend to use it. Belial. This is the name the Qumran community preferred for the chief adversary. The word means worthlessness or destruction or that which has no worth. It appears approximately 88 times across the Dead Sea Scrolls as a proper noun, not a descriptor. He is not simply a characteristic or a tendency. He is a commander. The community rule text is explicit about his origin and his function. God made Belial for the pit, an angel of hostility, and in darkness is his rule, and in his counsel is to bring wickedness and guilt about. He was created for this purpose. He commands it with the organizational authority of a general over an assembled army. The court is still in session. The file with your name on it is still open somewhere above this ceiling you have never thought to question. But in the Qumran cosmology, the ceiling itself has sides, and you have already been assigned to one of them. The community believed that humanity was divided at a fundamental level into lots, predetermined allocations to either the dominion of light or the dominion of darkness. You were not choosing between the two. You were born into one. And the dominion of darkness had a ruler, a structure, a chain of command, and a set of specific strategies detailed in another Qumran document called the Damascus document, which describes the 3 nets of Belial, methods by which the hostile dominion entraps the unwary in fornication, wealth, and the corruption of the temple. It reads less like theology and more like a security briefing for people who believe they are under active, organized assault. Alongside Belial in these texts is a figure who appears most prominently in the Book of Jubilees, which the Qumran community clearly held in high regard. His name is Mastema, drawn from a Hebrew root meaning hatred or hostility. In the Book of Jubilees, Mastema performs the same structural role as the adversary in Job. He petitions God, he requests permission to test, he operates within authorized parameters, but the darkness of his character has expanded considerably. He asks that the demons of the dead Nephilim spirits be left under his authority to corrupt humanity, and the request is granted, though partially. 9/10 of the spirits are granted to him, and 1/10 are restrained. He is also the figure who, in Jubilees, drives Abraham toward the near sacrifice of Isaac, in a scene that directly echoes the prologue of Job. The same cold procedural logic, the same petition before the court, the same authorized catastrophe descending on a righteous man who did nothing to summon it. What the Qumran materials accomplish, taken together, is a transformation of the entire experiential texture of evil. The adversary of Job was disturbing because he was bureaucratic, because suffering was the output of a managed process. The adversary of the Qumran texts is disturbing for a different, and in some ways more suffocating reason. He is ubiquitous. He has already divided the world. The angels of his dominion are already present in the spaces around you. The 3 nets are already laid. The battle has been underway since before you were conscious, and you are already a participant in it, already positioned on a side, already visible to commanders you cannot see. The acoustic atmosphere of this cosmology is specifically militarized. The War Scroll provides the sounds. Bronze trumpets calling the formations, the roar of a great multitude, the shout of gods and men, the blaring of the 7 priestly trumpets in a sequence designed to advance the lines of the sons of light through the darkness toward a confrontation that will shake the foundations of everything built on this earth. There is something half temple and half battlefield about all of it. Liturgy and combat fused into a single register, sacred rite and the mechanics of war indistinguishable from each other. Because in this cosmology, the two were never truly separate. The Essenes of Qumran were living in caves and tunnels and small stone structures above one of the most desolate landscapes on earth, watching the cliffs and the salt water below, copying texts in languages that most of their contemporaries had already stopped reading, and waiting for the moment when the invisible structure of the cosmos would finally become visible. They believed the moment was close. They prepared for it with extraordinary seriousness, and in their preparation, they produced a portrait of the adversary that had moved entirely beyond the cold courtroom of Job, entirely beyond the post-exilic theological adjustment, entirely beyond the Zoroastrian dualism that had shaped the Second Temple imagination. In the Qumran portrait, you are not watching a prosecutor at work. You are standing inside the army of one of 2 forces that have been at war since creation, and the general of the opposing army has your world mapped. your weaknesses cataloged, and his formations already arranged in the dark above your head. In 1945, a farmer digging in the cliffs of Upper Egypt, near a town called Nag Hammadi, broke open a sealed ceramic jar and found something that had been waiting inside it for approximately 1,600 years. What he found was not a single document. It was a library. 52 texts, written in Coptic on papyrus, bound into leather codices, buried with enough care that whoever placed them there expected they might one day be retrieved. Scholars have since dated the texts to the 3rd and 4th centuries, though the traditions they contain are older. They represent a strand of early Christian and pre-Christian cosmology that the Orthodox councils of the 4th century worked systematically to eliminate, and the people who buried them apparently believed that elimination was imminent. When you read the Nag Hammadi text carefully, you encounter a portrait of evil so extreme, so structurally radical, that it makes every previous version of the adversary look like a minor revision. The cold prosecutor of Job was disturbing because he was authorized. The expanding dominion of Belial was disturbing because it was organized and total. What the Nag Hammadi cosmology proposes is something past either of those categories. It proposes that the problem is not within creation. It proposes that the problem is creation itself. The Gnostic cosmological system begins at a level of reality so far above the material universe that the distance between them is essentially incomprehensible. At that highest level exists a true, transcendent divine source, pure light, pure knowledge, the pleroma, the fullness. This ultimate reality did not create the world you inhabit. It did not intend the world you inhabit. The material universe is not the product of divine wisdom and love. It is an accident, a mistake made in the outer dark by a lesser being who had no right to make it. The name most commonly given to this being in the Nag Hammadi texts is Yaldabaoth. In other texts, he is called Samael, which means the blind god, and Saklas, which means the fool. His origin is described in the Apocrypha of John as the product of a cosmic error, an emanation from the divine Pistis Sophia that moved outside the pleroma into the outer void and produced, in the darkness of that outer region, a being that inherited some trace of divine light but was surrounded entirely by shadow and had no knowledge of the higher reality above it. He was formed in darkness. He was animated by a distorted fragment of something that had been pure, and he had no idea what he was. You were never the hero of this story. You were always the case file. Yaldabaoth looked around at the darkness he had been born into and, knowing nothing of the true divine source above him, declared himself supreme. His exact words in the text are preserved with a precision that suggests the writers believed they mattered enormously. I am God. There is no other but me. The Nag Hammadi text immediately identifies this declaration as a sin against the incorruptible universe, the arrogance of a blind ruler proclaiming himself absolute in a dimension that is not, and never was, the highest one. He then created. He formed a hierarchy of lesser archons, ignorant beings like himself, and together they constructed the material cosmos. The stars, the planets, the laws of physics, the architecture of biology. They built it not as a gift, but as a prison, though the Gnostic texts are careful about whether Yaldabaoth understood it as such, or simply replicated in matter the blindness and limitation that defined his own existence. The result is the same regardless of intent. The physical universe is a structure built by ignorant powers to contain something they could sense but not understand. The divine spark, the fragment of true light that exists inside every human being, buried inside biological matter the archons assembled around it specifically to keep it blind to its own nature. The God of the Old Testament and the devil, in this suppressed tradition, are effectively the same figure. Yaldabaoth commands worship. He declares himself jealous. He punishes transgression with floods and fire and exile, the same tools as the God of the canonical text, because in the Gnostic reading, he is that God, the demiurge, the craftsman of the material prison, the one who demands that the sparks of true light inside you remain obedient to the cage he built around them. The sensory atmosphere of this cosmology is suffocation. There is no throne room of burning ice and celestial ceremony. There is a void, heavy and absolute, in which a serpent-bodied, lion-faced entity thrashes in cold darkness, declaring itself supreme with the desperate conviction of something that has never seen the light it came from and has no language for what it is missing. Above it, infinitely removed, the true pleroma radiates in silence. Below it, the material cosmos sits like a badly engineered architecture, real enough to trap in, false enough that liberation from it, once perceived, seems not just possible, but the only thing that ever mattered. This is where the adversary arrives at its most radical destination. Not a prosecutor operating under divine mandate, not a post-exilic theological adjustment, not a cosmic general commanding organized darkness, not even a fallen angel carrying forbidden knowledge down from the heights. The adversary in the Nag Hammadi tradition is the architect of the world you think is real, and the prison he built is the one you are sitting in right now, in your room, in your body, in the life you have constructed inside the only cosmos you have ever been permitted to perceive. Across 3,000 years of text and trauma and exile and discovery, the adversary changed shape with every generation that needed him to mean something new. He was a bureaucrat. He grew into a dualist counterforce. He fractured into 200 watchers carrying forbidden fire down from the mountains. He crystallized into a military commander with a documented chain of command and a battle manual already in circulation. He dissolved into an ignorant demiurge who built the walls of the world around you without knowing what he was containing. Each transformation answered a question the previous version could not. Each new shape of the adversary was an attempt, in the language of cosmic myth, to locate the source of suffering without placing it inside the hands of the good. The questions changed. The architecture of the answer changed. The adversary absorbed them all. And now, tonight, the courts are empty. The throne room of crystalline cold and burning ceiling is still. The files are closed, for now. The trumpets of the war scroll have gone quiet in the desert, in the dark above the salt water, in the stone jars where the answers were buried and left for someone else to carry. The Nephilim's orphaned spirits have grown tired. Yaldabaoth thrashes somewhere in a dimension so far beneath the true light that the distance between them is not measurable in any unit you were taught. All of it, the prosecutor and the general and the prison architect and the dark Prometheus on the mountain, has dissolved into the same deep, indifferent stillness that surrounds you right now. You are lying in your room. The ceiling above you is ordinary. The darkness around you is the comfortable darkness of a world that is, for this particular moment, not asking anything of you. Consider what you have carried tonight. The weight of 3,000 years of a single question. The weight of every community that looked at the suffering in its world and reached upward into the metaphysics and tried to name what it found there. Job in his ruined fields. The exiled priests rewriting their history under Babylonian skies. The Essenes in their desert preparation, their scrolls sealed and waiting. the Gnostic readers of the buried codices, certain that the world above them was a prison, and that somewhere past it the true light still burned. All of them asking, in different languages and different centuries and different registers of despair, the same fundamental question: where does it come from? You have heard their answers tonight. You have traveled through the cold chambers of the celestial court. You have stood at the edges of the Watcher's descent. You have read the battle formations of a war you were born into the middle of. You have looked into the lion face of the blind architect and recognized, in his declaration of supremacy, the specific loneliness of a being who has never seen what it came from. Let that recognition settle now. Let it become heavy and warm rather than cold. The adversary, in every form you encountered tonight, was always a mirror. He reflected the specific shape of what each age could not accept about the world it inhabited. He carried the unbearable weight of evil's origin so that the divine could remain clean. He grew into whatever the theology required, and in growing, he became a record of human suffering, of human confusion, of the ancient and unresolved need to believe that the suffering has a source that can be named and eventually opposed. You were never the case file the prosecution intended to close. You were the scholar in the back of the courtroom who came to understand the proceedings. The heavy doors of the Apocrypha vault remain open in the dark behind you. There is more to find in there, more courts, more dissents, more cosmic architectures assembled around questions that have not finished asking themselves. But that is for another night. For now, the trumpets are silent. The prosecutors have gone home. The blind God sits in his cold void, and the true light sits in its high silence. And between them, the world turns in ordinary darkness. And you are here, inside it, breathing slowly, carried by nothing more complicated or more profound than the fact of your own continued existence. What would you do in a universe this old if you discovered the prison had a door?
Sub tenebris, in aeternum vocamus. Nos manet. All things must return to the void.